So it's the next day, and I'm going to continue to attempt talking to myself daily until at least June 20th. Or not every day, but nearly every day. And I'm starting to feel kind of apathetic about this whole self-dialogue process. Maybe I'm tired of listening to myself. I'm not sure. Maybe it's also the process of taking this hearty nutritionals, and I think it's disidentifying me from everything that I was saying initially. It's sort of like if my brain manages to go back to so-called normal, or how it was before it was ever medicated in this way, it's almost like the whole experience is erased in a way, because that conversation is no longer a necessary conversation because it's not part of my life anymore. Years ago, when I had chronic fatigue syndrome, I would talk about it all the time, and that was my main topic of conversation. Whenever I would talk to people, I would tell them what I was going through and what I was doing and blah, blah, blah. But then once I was healed from chronic fatigue, once I finally figured out what to do to allow my body to heal, after a short period of time, I just didn't even talk about it. I didn't even think about it. And I remember talking to myself about this at one point or another, that would I even want to talk about this anymore? And I was talking about that when I was thinking about going to California and wondering, will I still talk about mental health? And then I wasn't planning on tapering off my meds, but it just turns out that's what I've decided to do based on things that have happened. And so if I taper off my meds and I'm taking the supplements and I'm not on the meds and I'm feeling okay, what is there to talk about? It's sort of like exiting the need to have that conversation. And not that I won't still. When I go back home, I want to find ways to help. But if I went back home, the conversation I would have with people would be different if I tapered off meds than if I don't taper off meds. So if I go back home and I'm off my meds and I'm doing fine, at least for the time being, there's no guarantee that it'll be forever. That's a different conversation than if I go back and I'm still on my medications. And I'm just wondering if my brain is decoupling from this conversation because of taking the nutrition. It's not so caught up in those narratives and having insights into these mechanisms when the mechanisms are no longer going on. And I'm not saying that I'm out of the woods. I'm just, in a way, having a few insights about this process of tapering off, and then maybe tapering off the need to have self-dialogue. And 6 years ago, I went to California for 3 weeks before I was medicated. And when I went back home, I was in the state of magic, and then I was medicated. So it would be cool if I went back to California like I have, and then go back home off medication, kind of like none of this ever happened. And of course it did, but it feels like going back to the beginning and then tapering off and then going back home. And imagine if I could be kind of like I was before I left. Doesn't mean life was perfect by any means, but I guess the prospect of coming off these meds is pretty huge for me. And I didn't have the greatest sleep last night. There were people talking upstairs really late, and I need quiet in order to sleep. So I'm hoping to get better sleep tonight and go from there. Yesterday I had a good day, and I found a place to charge the electric vehicle faster. So it's sitting over there right now charging. It's a ways away. And I just sat there drinking coconut water, which I shouldn't have done because part of having trouble falling asleep was that I had to pee really bad. And if I fall asleep before I have to go, it's not a problem. But if people keep waking me up and my bladder keeps filling up, then eventually it reaches the critical point where I have to get up and go. So if I keep up with this process, around 300 videos of varying lengths, and I'm starting to even doubt a lot of the things that I said. And not that I took anything that I've said seriously anyways, they're just random things, saying random things, and getting with the process of so-called bipolar and how we tend to have access to a lot of words, sometimes write them down. So I'm just really getting with that process and acknowledging that process and talking about some of the things I write down. Because usually we only take seriously what we learn from other people who are professionals and who are in the know. And then if we write something about what they said and don't really change it very much and just reorganize everything people already said, then that's okay. But if we say things that are new that we just kind of get as a download, that's not okay. And these downloads aren't necessarily true or false or anything. They're just downloads and just sharing them. Just like a painter might do a painting, a bipolar person might have a lot of words that are kind of more like art than real fact. So why can't we be more artful with our words and really wonder and be creative? If it's translated into a song, well, that's okay. But it's not okay to just say it in a normal speaking tone like we do day to day and say whatever comes to mind. And that's something that comes to mind just might be from somewhere else than our own memory bank. So it's getting with that process, acknowledging that process, and it's likely that a lot of people who go through this process that's labeled bipolar could do something similar by just getting with some of the words they've had access to over time. And I used to get a lot more from editing my videos and listening to the insights that I say, because some of them I make up on the spot. And I find I'm not making up as much on the spot, and I'm not finding new insights while listening to what I said in the editing process. So it could be that my brain is just not learning as much from this process anymore, and that could be a good thing, because I don't necessarily want to sit and talk to myself all the time. Maybe I will change to a weekly video format or something, just to keep engaged in dialogue with myself, but not make it my one thing. And I was thinking a little bit about what I might want to switch to when the year is up on June 20th. And I definitely want to get back into taking care of my body. I've been eating a lot of simple carbohydrates like rice and chips and granola in the morning, and not a lot of greens and veggies. And part of that is financial, and part of that is laziness, and part of that is I haven't had access to a vehicle to really have a super healthy diet. But on June 20th, I'll have about a month left to go in California if I keep to the schedule I'm thinking. And maybe for that month, I'll just splurge, dip into my line of credit, and try to get my body in really good shape in terms of nutrition and take really good care of my body. Because by June 20th, I should be off my meds. So, great, by really spending, say, $500 in a month or something to buy really good quality food. And then when I get back home, I want to devote some time to my family because I really miss them. I really miss them today. And if I wasn't tapering off meds right now, I might just leave. But I feel it would be good to stay down here where it's peaceful and quiet with good air and a lot of beauty around to complete the process. And also just go back and know that I did it instead of being halfway there and then having to answer questions about, oh, if you're going to go see your psychiatrist and blah, blah, blah. So I'd rather just complete the process. And so part of taking care of my body would be just getting into optimal shape, using that month to really prepare for going back home. It's going to be noisier. There's going to be more people around, sort of. There's a lot of people around here too. There's going to be no stars. Yesterday I bumped into somebody and they asked, are we going to get to see all the stars tonight? And that question just made me feel so good, because that person was so excited to be around nature, and they were looking at all the bunnies running around, and I'm not really used to all the nature here because it's so beautiful, but that won't be back home so much unless I go and seek it out. And I might get a stand-up paddleboard or try it again a time or two to see if that's something I want to do. And the other thing I really want to focus on is altruism. And I've talked about altruism and how it becomes part of how the brain operates in map consciousness. And I think I want to learn through the process of altruism. And sharing some of this might be part of that altruism. I'll probably do some things to attempt to monetize it a little bit in some way, because if I can then devote my time to helping people that need help and not necessarily having to charge them. Like, I don't want to all of a sudden be some kind of coach or peer supporter that has to charge people who barely have anything. I'd love to be able to give people scholarships to take hearty nutritionals to come off medication if they can't afford it. Things like that. So I'm not sure how that'll work, but yeah. So when I get home, I'll focus on figuring out what to do with this content, if anything. I'll have about 300 videos, and maybe that'll be about 150 hours or something, and I could edit into something short and sweet, or I could listen to it and keep going with the process, or I could... There's a lot of different things that could be done with it, and the intention is to be helpful to other people. And watching my videos, I could go back to the beginning and find some of the clues of what I was talking to myself about in terms of what I might want to explore, because I totally forget. I feel like I'm going back to this blank slate, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just difficult to know what to do when one has such a blank brain. I was thinking about how we all have this inner chatter going on, and I was thinking about if psychosis is like accessing the collective chatter, and it gets confusing because we have thoughts that we think aren't ours, or that we're not thinking, that are coming from somewhere else, and it could just be the collective chatter. The brain manages to keep our chatter in this very narrow loop, but if it expands to something beyond that, all of a sudden we have access to more chatter than we are equipped to deal with. But in a way, it allows us to see other things that we added in the collective chatter, but we only have access to our little chatter. But our little chatter is part of the collective, meaning it still contributes to the collective chatter. And then if somebody gets access to the collective chatter, in a way they become responsible for resolving some of that. I don't know if that makes any sense, but we see that we do have greater responsibility beyond our own chatter. And that goes with increasing empathy as well. And I talked about that stuff before, but I don't think I ever thought about it in that way exactly. And I'm going to continue with my notebook to some extent. I feel like I don't want to talk about this stuff anymore, but I also feel like I want to acknowledge the process that I've been doing and continue with it, because even if it's sort of less energetic and it kind of tapers off, it could be good to do that and be sure that it's time to move on to something else. It's sort of like therapy. In general, the goal is to not be talking to the therapist forever, for the rest of one's life. So in the same way, I don't know if I need to continue to talk to myself like this. It'd be more fun actually to document altruistic activities or talk to people or something. And I have some notes from things that I read or things that I was listening to online, and some of it was with Dr. David Bohm, and I wrote down a few of his quotes. I think this was from the book Wholeness and the Implicate Order, or it could be from a talk he had with somebody named Nicholson or something. And I'll quote him, and I'm not trying to infringe on copyright, I just think he says a lot of genius things that might point people to reading a little bit of his work and remind myself to continue reading his work. He mentioned how feelings play over the whole body when there's a resistance to an action. So if we suspend an action, we feel a feeling, whereas if we did the action, we would no longer feel the feeling. I think he gave the example of punching somebody out. So if we stood there and we wanted to punch somebody, we'd have all these rage feelings, but if we actually did the punching, we would not feel the feelings, but we would do the action. And I related that to embodied mania and how it's important to act on the altruistic feelings. So it's important to do something about those feelings for humanity, that altruism and that passion, because that could be, in a way, why and how the energy builds up and becomes too much. It's because we're not able to act fast enough. And at first we usually do, but at some point it does end up building up. And part of it could be is that we need to share that energy. So that's why I think that it could be good for some of us to find some altruism projects to do together. Not that there isn't a lot of that out in the world, there is. But the difference is when we feel in our hearts and minds and beings that we need to act that way to actually be in alignment with our neurology, it's a little bit different of a movement, because then we're actually supporting each other to fully embody that together and not just working 2 hours volunteering for our resume each week as sort of a tokenistic thing in our life. It's really different. It's almost like supporting each other to be that way, otherwise we will explode. And it will implode upon us, and it will turn into a process against the personal me, because we're not able to embody that altruism and that we and that non-self, that egolessness. And David Bohm mentioned that thought creates mechanical pressure. Say, for example, the thought, he shouldn't have. If we're thinking that, it's creating mechanical pressure in the body, like we want to act out or say something or whatever. And I feel like that other mode, that mode of perception and action beyond thought, has a different kind of mechanical pressure. When the pure perception hits the clear mind screen, there's a calculation, there's a pressure, and that pressure of the clear perception actually creates the action. And it's a living calculation. It's not a calculation based on the past, such as he shouldn't have, so that means I'm going to punch him, etc. So that pressure and that perception action is really the dance with the universe. And these are the things that I'd like to get in alignment with again. So there's possibility for more degrees of freedom. And there was something interesting mentioned about how during a polygraph test, a lie detector test, it's detecting the increase in heart rate, the spike in the adrenal activity. And it's interesting that it was mentioned that in the polygraph test or lie detector test, it measures things like increased heart rate. And when the heart rate increases, it means it's a lie. And oftentimes in something like so-called psychosis, the heart rate increases. And so it feels like one is being reinserted into the lie of society and all of that structure. And when we're reacquainting ourselves with that, or being thrust into being reacquainted with that, we have all these reactions almost like we're reacting to a lie. And I'm not saying it's that. I just find it interesting that it's disturbing and it disturbs us. And it's the values of society, and we're reacting to being dipped back into that. So when we go into map consciousness, our whole nervous system becomes like a polygraph compass. All of our senses and our nervous system react to truth or falsehood, and we move away from the false structures of society and we move towards this other dimension that we're being led to. But the more we bump up against the structures of society, the more we're in retreat, the more we're turning away. And then eventually we're turning away so much that we start to think things like somebody's after us, or there's some kind of conspiracy, because we're in retreat. We're fearful, we're running away, and so the brain is telling us stories about what must be true to make our fear justified. But really, the structures of society are just that scary. And when we're in that space of being so sensitive, we can really feel it, whereas most people can't on a day-to-day basis. They just go about their own life. And I wrote down that even these words could be coming from that other dimension, in that they're like a direct download from being in touch with this other dimension to some extent. Thought builds up when we don't act. When we're really acting with the moment, we don't think. It's like our whole process, our whole movement is thought at that moment. It's not this little process in the brain talking around, moving us. We're moving with the thinking stuff, the mind stuff of the whole cosmos. It's like it's molding us and we're molding it, versus just having this thing go on and we're basically sleeping while walking around. And we're not molding the whole universe, we're just leaving a little trail of dirt as we walk along. There's got to be some kind of manic equilibrium. It's interesting how I was feeling kind of blah, and then I just did that half hour of self-dialogue and I feel a little bit better. So maybe I'm back on the self-dialogue train. I don't know. We'll see. It'd be nice to at some point do videos that I don't have to edit. I did like editing them through the process though, because I'd often have more insights from listening to myself, but it'd be nice to just be in conversation with other people and then do videos that don't need editing. Projection is anticipation of fear or pleasure. And it seems we live in anticipation and not participation, because we're always projecting what we're anticipating. And so we're participating with our own projections, but not actually what is. I'm wondering when I go home if I can improvise my life. I wonder if we can get to a place where life distracts us from the programs of society. And I think that's kind of what mania is, what magic is when we're so in tune with life that we're distracted from the programs of society. And that's sort of what distraction is. It's sort of not paying attention to what we're told we should be paying attention to, what we're programmed to pay attention to. And then our own life energy moves us away from that which we're programmed and conditioned towards. And mania is just an exaggeration of this. So instead of working on something and then being distracted, so-called distracted for a couple of seconds and then going back to it, it's like being distracted and then distracted and distracted, but really, it's not really distraction. It's moving towards life and moving with the life energy that we are. And when that first starts happening, it's kind of haphazard because we've moved so far along a trajectory of programming. And the thing with the life energy too is it's not necessarily purposeful and it's not necessarily goal-oriented in terms of what we've been programmed to do. I think there's value in so-called distraction in that we're moving off the track that we've been pushed into by the pressures of our conditioning. And Boehm mentioned that the values of society act so quickly that we feel like we've chosen something, but really it's always our programming and the values of society that we've been conditioned in. So there's an illusion of freedom of choice. And these programs have power because of the values assigned to the programs. But we don't see the actual real value of beauty right in front of us. And it seems like there's no longer advantages to going along with all the prejudices of society and the community. And our nervous systems can no longer handle it. And in so-called mania, it's like we're auditioning and interviewing for the universe, to work with the universe and for the universe, and as the universe. And I'm not sure if I'll release this content as a supernova, just release it all at once. And I'm not sure if anyone's done videos that way, just releasing them all at the same time. It's a content supernova. And we can't play games with someone yesterday, but that's what we're doing by playing with our thoughts. We're playing with the things of yesterday. Thoughts are playing the game of yesterday. And our nervous system is supposed to be a translator of light and information and energy, and not just a looper of thought. But the loop of thought is interfering with the clear translation, and if we can't translate the information, we can't transform. And I feel like language is a gift. It's a privilege and not a right. And we need to be careful how we use it. And something's wrong with the brain organ in that it's not translating beauty. The sense of beauty is turned off. And there's that saying that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, our brain and our eyes are so clogged up with thought that we can't see beauty. And the brain needs to sense holistically in order to see beauty, because beauty is a combination of all the senses working together harmoniously. And I was informed by someone that it's odd to hear our own voice in our own head. And I've talked quite a bit about this. And I'm pretty sure I used to hear my own voice in my own head somewhat. And this is what's referred to as inner chatter and self-talk, etc. So if that is incorrect and most people don't hear their own voice in their own head, just replace that sound analogy with energy or vibration of some sort. I wrote down that it's interesting we can write on the universe, just like I'm writing on the page to make notes. I'm actually writing on the universe. Something that wasn't there is put there by my action. And it's the same with embodied mania. We're actually writing on the universe, but in a different way. So we make manifest, and we can have a manic manifesto. So imagine when we think, we're actually writing what we think on our brain cells with a pen. Now, would we really want those things there? We're writing those words on our brain cells, and the brain cells can't grow properly in that sound or noise or vibration or interference. It's actually interfering with the brain's growth and movement and fluidity. But when the brain is silent, the universe can grow through the brain. The resonances of light and information and vibration play through the brain. And remembering long enough is knowledge. We store up information in our brain, and we store it up to use it for some kind of purpose or use it against something or someone. But in this state, when the brain cells start to decouple from memory, there is no purpose because the brain can't remember long enough to have any kind of purpose. More of the brain capacity is diverted to seeing and acting in the moment, perception and action, based on the moment and not based on past knowledge stored up. And perception creates energy, and it arises and is released in action. And I wonder if there's any patterns in mania, if the brain is looking for a new pattern, or if it's beyond any pattern. And the trouble is, when one is in mania, one's living beyond pattern for too long, whereas the whole society is based on pattern. So one bumps up against patterns and gets patterned back into the pattern, but in a new pattern called mental illness. And the brain seems to have a compulsion to label energy with thought. And it messes up the new energy coming in by putting that old thought energy on the new energy. And there's a compulsion to know instead of just be with. I even was thinking today if there was a type of therapy where people say something to their therapist, and instead of the therapist saying something back, they just said, okay, can we just be with that? Is that a fact? Can we be with that fact? And we're often categorizing things based on like and dislike. Facebook must really help with this. But that's what forms an image. We form it according to, if we like something, we're comparing it to all the things we've liked or disliked. So that creates the center of like and dislike. And I wrote this long bit, so I'll just read it in the spirit of getting through this. Thoughts don't create things. They change your relationship to things. From a living thing to a labeled thing. Something unknown to that which we think we know. Something figured out. Therefore, there's no relationship. The label prevents relationship and is the efficiency. The brain doesn't have to use energy or create energy to be attentive and find out. Attention creates energy. There's passion to find out. Therefore, relationship creates energy if it's fluid, dynamic, and a play of energy, information, light, instead of that sound identity that fragments it and reduces its living quality to knowledge, the past. Thought reduces the living quality of energy in relationship to knowledge, stored up image words of the past. The algorithm of the brain is this: reducing life to knowledge about life for efficiency in relationship in favor of programmed values. I am just a peer saying what appears to me. I am the peer potential project. Next episode, I have a few pages of notes from a talk on the Neuroscience Summit by Joe Dispenza. And he talks about some neurology and stuff like that. And so it should be really cool, and it'll probably take a video or two. Maybe less, maybe more, but I'm getting through some of this stuff, and that feels good. I happened to watch my video from February 12th, right before I left for California, and it was interesting to watch. I think I look really different, and I was speaking about whether or not I'll continue to talk about mental health in a different context that's not related to mental health. And I also talked about how I would taper off meds when I got back from California. But really, it happened that I'm tapering off meds in California, so I'm still talking about mental health because I'm talking about the process of coming off medications. So in a way, I'm transcending the system like I wanted to. And I was also expressing my gratitude to people who've helped me throughout my journey. And I really miss those people a lot. So much that I kind of want to just go home. But at the same time, if I'm able to come off these meds and go home as a superhuman version of myself, that would be even better. So the next couple months might be focused on becoming superhuman and supernova. So it's transcending the system, becoming superhuman, and creating the supernova. And I also remember that I kind of wanted to start watching my old videos on the anniversary date of the video. So June 20th will be the anniversary of the first video in this conversation with myself. I did a few videos before June 20th, but I didn't include them in the playlist because I don't think I edited those, or I think I just talked straight without pausing. So I'll include those somewhere else for sure. But I'll watch my June 20th video on June 20th and see what I had to say. Plus by then I should be off these meds. And I looked all put together in that video, and my hair was straight, and I just remember the feeling of having all my clothes and a variety of things to wear and straightening my hair and just these simple things that I haven't been doing here. And when I get home, I'll probably be saying, oh, I miss the hummingbirds, and I miss the this, and I miss the that. There, I straightened out my phone screen because I think I was drawing my neck by looking like this. But yeah, I'll be saying what I miss here when I get back there for sure. And I remember before I left feeling like I just want to leave, and now I'm here feeling like I just want to leave and go back. And so it's interesting how long it's been since I've really felt at home somewhere. My last place was super noisy, and I didn't feel at home there. And it seems like I've been struggling more since that not at home thing has been going on. And I also, in listening to what I had to say about the gratitude towards the people that have helped me and been there for me and been acquaintances or friends with me, I feel like if I go home as a superhuman version of myself, then I will have accomplished something. But even if I just go home and I'm off meds, but I haven't yet gotten back into shape in terms of a healthy body, then I feel that's still really something. But if I can work on this content supernova and transcending bipolar, and also becoming superhuman in terms of being really healthy, then that would be even better. And there's a barrier in terms of financial stuff, and there's maybe a barrier in terms of motivation a little bit. I find that it's easy to just eat whatever is there and not really put effort in. And interestingly enough, there was a long period of time in my life, many years, that my first priority was putting the most healthy, clean, nutritious food in my mouth. And then I got to a point, being healthy for what? And so I put more effort into the for what. And I don't know if that's right or wrong, but I think I need a bit more on the healthy side. So right now, in terms of the content supernova, I am downloading the audios from my videos because I have them uploaded to YouTube. So then I can make audio only YouTube videos. So I'm using Media Humans YouTube to MP3 software and extracting the audio and downloading it. And then I have the audio files of my videos. And then I'm going to use Tunes to Tube, which is a web browser based thing that you upload the audio files with just a picture. So I'm going to have everything organized, one stream as the videos and then one stream of just the audios with a picture, and that way I can decide if I just want to release the audios first. Just that way it's a little bit less imposing to have somebody yammering on just audio as opposed to audio and video. So that way I have the options of doing both. And also extracting the audios is because I'm also going to put them on SoundCloud. And I'm going to figure out a way to monetize. Patreon has a good article out about that, about how YouTube isn't really paying as much for ads anymore, and I don't know the particulars on that. So it's good to diversify in the ways that one monetizes one's videos. And so I will try to work on some of those. And perhaps when I start watching my videos, I will add a description about the video and add a title that makes sense or something, because right now it's just by date. So it's possible that I might spend more time making this easier to search in some way, or I don't know. We'll see what happens. So yeah, after the 1 year mark, it could be more about processing the stuff and making it available. And the exciting part for me is if I come off my meds, that will make it a lot easier to really put this out there, and it would show that it's possible, and it would show that all the words that we connect with in bipolar are just the words we connect with, and connecting with those and giving them some value and voicing some of them can actually be part of the healing process, instead of just saying a few things, having a label, and then never really exploring it any further. So I want to talk a little bit about the stuff that Joe Dispenza or something talked about on the Neuroscience Summit. And he talked about how with each bit of information, we make 1,600 to 2,600 new synaptic connections. Imagine how many are made in the bipolar brain. And I talked about that in previous videos, and then how at some point the brain has to go through a pruning process similar to the one that we do when we're children, and we prune out the information that is apparently not necessary. But I think the process that happens in bipolar shows that there are other necessary things to learn and understand and know. And I think the bipolar process could be a compensation for that in a way, because we've eliminated so many of the bits of information through what society wants us to make salient. And eventually it has to regrow to make sure that there's some kind of diversity in the brain. Diversity in perception is needed. And he talked about philosopher, initiate, master. And I feel like map consciousness, the process of mania, initiates us into this process. And it's up to us to learn and understand and grow and master this energy. We spend so much time trying to master our thoughts, trying to control our thoughts. But there's this other energy that's way beyond thought that is even more of a challenge to master. But we can master mania. And he talked about psychoimmunology and epigenetics. And I think that creating this context is in a way part of psychoimmunology. We need to become immune to the memes of psychiatry and the mental health system and crowd them out with our own memes and context. And I feel like mania closes the gap between knowledge and experience. It's almost like experience first, and out of that comes some knowledge and wisdom which we can understand after we've ridden that roller coaster. Perhaps if we don't try to understand it, the roller coaster keeps happening. And mania, in a way, is coming back to our senses. We really feel things and are in touch with things. It's a different language. And I came across a video on YouTube of Oprah interviewing Paul Coelho. And they're talking about learning the language of the signs. And to me, map consciousness, or so-called mania, is a crash course in learning the signs. It's like having to learn the signs or else crash back down into the world where we don't live by the signs. And it's not as fun of a world. So I find it interesting that a lot of these inspirational speakers and things, they're saying the same thing, but they're just talking about it from a different vantage point. Maybe the vantage point of coming upon that and not having their experiences pathologized. If they were to go to a psychiatrist and said, I saw this and this means that, and I saw this and this means that, and these were signs, and so I ended up over here in synchronicity, they might say that sounds like mania. It sounds like a mental illness. And the doctor can only go by what the person's saying. They don't really know how the other is feeling inside. So the other might be feeling completely calm, cool, and collected, but just based on what they say, they could be actually labeled with something. So there's this group of people who have managed to escape the label, and there's a large group of people who don't. And it seems like we're still talking about the same thing. But it's different in that some of us get so immersed in it that we can't really be in regular consciousness one moment when it's convenient, and then in this super consciousness or altered state the other moment. It's always an altered state. And again, part of that is to try to alter the state of the world so then it could be more in alignment with altered states. And so Oprah says the signs are everywhere all the time. And they are. So if they are, what's the real difference? It's being able to see them, being able to perceive them, being able to be in touch with them. And in map consciousness, we're so clear that we can see everything. We can see perhaps too many signs at the same time. This language of signs, by making mistakes. And to me, that's what the fall into, say, a psychosis or depression back to regular consciousness is making mistakes and falling out of the ability to see the signs. Because seeing the signs and living by the signs is a gift. And it really takes clear perception to maintain that. Not going back into old habitual patterns and structures and ego consciousness 1 second, and then living by the signs the next second. Not being in the ego conscious when it's convenient, and then, oh, there's a nice sign, I'll go there now. It's actually living in that other language, negating the language of the ego, and living by this other language of signs, which is a living thing, and it requires really living and perceiving in the moment. And he says the universe is showing you signs, and sometimes you take a wrong step, but you correct it. And they're talking about learning the language of the world. And that is the same thing that I'm talking about. It's a different world than the one we live in. Because the world we live in is based on the language and the way we speak. That changes what we see. And back to Joe, he said, don't think equal to your environment. To change, you need to be greater than your environment. And when he said this, it made me think of how in so-called mania, we definitely feel and are greater than our environment. And we are changing it. How we are when we pop into those states of consciousness is changing the world around us ever so slightly. But when we come back to the world that is unchanged, but only slightly changed, we go into a state of consciousness that is a large change from our environment. And we're changing the environment. We're changing the totality, but only slightly. So when we go back down, we've only changed the totality slightly, but we're definitely feeling the hangover of yo-yoing back to that regular level of consciousness. So can we see possibility greater than our environment even when we're not in those states? So a key is not to make the energy into the me, to share it. And part of that is translating that energy so others can share it too, so others can see that and experience that context or their own version of that context. And it could be changing our biology to manic biology. And after I finish reading the book by Dr. Mercola, Fat for Fuel, I think I'm going to read the book Brain Maker by Dr. Perlmutter. It could have some insights into making the brain. And I think he mentioned that the heart has the strongest magnetic field. And when we're in coherence, it actually sends out that energy on carrier waves. It sends out the new electronic signature on carrier waves. And I made a note to myself about the importance of the coherence of the heart based on what happens to my heart. Oftentimes we focus on what our thoughts are telling us in terms of the scary stuff or some kind of so-called delusions or hallucinations. But that's coupled with some kind of physiological reaction in the body. Besides the story my brain might tell me when that happens and it's scary, there's that physiological sensation that's happening in my heart, and that is producing or co-occurring with this sensation in my heart. So I could try and dissect all this thinking stuff, or I could go back to focusing on my heart. So it's important to become comfortable in the unknown. And how can we get lost in the unknown without getting lost? And he might have said that coherence in the brain and heart upgrades the biology. And that's why I'm doing that coherence breathing. And I think that's where he said that the senses become heightened by 25%. and awareness and consciousness and energy just by having this coherence. And so I think there's got to be some kind of coherence in the manic state, because we do have increased energy, we do have increased consciousness and awareness and sensitivity especially. So it could be actually a super coherent state, and coming back down to the non-coherent or dissonant state of society is actually kind of traumatizing. And I wrote down circuits reorganized to reflect awe and wonder. Inward experience reorganizes past circuits. And I wrote this a while ago, so that's probably something that he said. And a mystical experience can wash away the past, and so can a manic experience. And part of thought is prediction, and we like to predict things. So as a result, we become habitual because of our own predictions. And we're obsessed with prediction in science, too. But when we think in terms of a subject acting upon an object, then prediction is part of that equation. But if there is no subject-object duality, there's a beingness that brings about possibilities that are possible when we see them as possible. So it's about perceiving in the moment and not projecting something to move towards. It's the difference between trying to figure stuff out and just figuring out the equation to figuring into the equation. And that could be the difference between what I'm doing now and what the next part will be too, is figuring in instead of trying to figure things out. So the altruism, the action. And maybe I'll carry on doing these videos for a while longer, because it's important that this shows that it leads to some kind of embodiment of something. Not just talking and then coming off meds and then living my happy little life, but actually doing something. Embodying that mania. That was the original point. And I wrote down that we like what feels familiar, so we create familiar feelings and thoughts. And when we go into map consciousness, we're connected with the unfamiliar. And so sometimes we get unfamiliar thoughts, but those thoughts might have nothing to do with the actual experience or moving with that energy. It could just be unfamiliar thoughts being created because we're moving in unfamiliar energy. And since our brain is wired to create thoughts, it just creates unfamiliar thoughts. So it's important to not attach to any of those and be more with the energy and look for the signs and not personalize this, because it's actually a depersonalizing process. And there's a difference between beliefs, as in holding a belief and moving towards that, or holding that as one's reality, and experiencing that vision in mania as an actual knowing. It's not a believing. And that's part of the reason why it's difficult to come back to regular consciousness, is because we were in the state of knowing, and actually knowing through our own being, not by sitting down in a chair and somebody telling us, or by our parents telling us, or by what we learned in school or university or on the news or anything. It's a knowing without knowing how we know, but really, really feeling and being that. And when we drop out of that just to be told it's all this meaningless mental illness, it just adds to the confusion of it all. And I wrote down something here that he was talking about, but I'm not sure what it is. But something about gamma superconsciousness and beyond conscious and subconsciousness, there's the whole mind. And when the analytical mind decreases, there's a suggestibility, and something can slip by the subconscious mind and change the autonomic nervous system. So it made me think about how the autonomic nervous system, or ANS, is always there waiting to have something slip by and change it. But it can only really be changed by something living, because the analytical mind has to decrease. It has to be quiet. So it's not something analytical that's actually going to change the ANS in any kind of way. So it's only the moment that can change the ANS. Some information in the moment, something living. So the ANS isn't warped by the programs. The programs are sort of superimposed on it, but the programs are usually analytical type things. So in a way, the moment modulates the ANS. And in map consciousness, we're so in touch with the moment. I feel like it's a modulation of the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, and that's what's happening to alter the behaviors and the gestures based on the information coming to the ANS in the moment and getting by this analytical mind that makes us think before we act. And there can be some value to that, but not necessarily if we don't want to get captured. So that's it for today. Next time I'll talk more about what Joe Dispenza has to say and talk a bit more about processing the supernova and how I'm doing with the tapering. I didn't even say, last night it took a little bit longer to fall asleep, and I'm feeling all right today. I'm feeling pretty good. And other than that, not too much to report. It's pretty smooth right now, and that's good. So I think I'll just have to get used to it taking a little bit longer to fall asleep, but that's not really a big deal. I already feel like in my heart that I'm off these meds. Like, I feel as if I've done it, and I haven't, but I just want that so much. So last night I again slept pretty well. I'm noticing these last 2 or 3 days I'm actually waking up earlier. It's taking me a little bit longer to fall asleep, but I wake up before my alarm, and I'm waking up around 7 a.m. instead of sleeping till 9 if I have the chance. So I like that the days are a little bit longer, and that's good because then I'll get a little bit more tired being awake for longer and then fall asleep at night, which takes a little bit longer, but at least I have more hours in the day. And I'm feeling pretty good. I'm feeling pretty calm. I think it was last night I did notice a little bit of a strange anxiety type feeling around my diaphragm area when I was doing the coherence breathing, and I thought maybe that was going to affect my sleep or something, but it didn't. And last night was the first night I fell asleep without remembering. And what that means is the 2 or 3 nights before, since I did that last medication reduction, I really noticed when my body clicked into that semi-awake, semi-asleep state, and I was very conscious of it. I was very watchful of waiting for my body to click into that, and it took a while. And then when I noticed it clicked in that way I sort of recognized how long it took me to fall asleep. Whereas last night I just drifted off into sleep without going into that in-between. And I think that in-between is where that scary heart thing can happen. And so just falling asleep was kind of nice to not be like, oh, now I'm starting to fall asleep. I can feel that. and then still sort of being a little bit like wondering if I will fall asleep. So the process is still going well. It's pretty smooth, and hopefully it continues to be smooth. It's so smooth I don't even really think about it. I don't even really think about how I'm tapering off meds, and that's a pretty big deal. And at this rate, I will be off them by next Friday. So about 10 days. And maybe they'll recommend I stay on a smaller dose than 75 milligrams for a while too. I'm not sure. But we'll see how that goes. So that's my main focus right now, is coming off these meds, and I need to keep that in mind before I try to make other changes, like trying to eat healthy or putting any other kind of stress out there. And this morning when I was in the shower, I had an insight into how when we connect with this energy, we become a channel instead of an ego. And the ego, in a way, blocks the channel. It's like a dam. And so when those structures are not there, whether it's just temporarily, we become a channel for that time, and then we go back to our ego consciousness. And this could be part of the up and down of bipolar, is going between being a channel and just channeling the moment, and what we're saying isn't necessarily coming from our ego memory banks, to going back to being our ego. And a way to get with the process would be to channel more. And I remember watching a video by Victoria Budenko called 12 Steps to Raw Food. And she mentioned in it that we learn by channeling. And that statement always stayed with me. And in a way, a lot of my talking to myself is just channeling and learning from myself, or learning from that channel. And that's why I tend to learn from what I say, because it just sort of comes through me. I'm not really premeditating what I say. And I am excited to get off these meds and move on to the embodiment phase, because I'm reading this book, The Man Who Wasn't There, by Anil Ananthaswamy, and it's really well written. I don't read too many books like this, but it's really well written, and it's quite fascinating to read. And in part of it, he's talking about people with Alzheimer's, and how even though in the late stages some people can barely say a word, some of them can't say anything, they've observed people able to perform certain ritual prayers in the right context. They just get up and perform the whole thing and say words and recite prayers, for example. I'm not saying it right, but they're saying that there's an embodied self that's deeper than these things that we lose through the process of Alzheimer's or degenerative brain diseases. And so what isn't lost, partially, is this embodied stuff, the stuff that really runs deep and is meaningful. And a lot of these story constructs and narratives we lose in that process. And I think too, in the process of bipolar, it changes our narrative. It changes our narrative in the process. It makes us give different narratives and speak about different things than even our own personal narrative a lot of the times. And what I don't like is how we're sort of forced into this narrative of having this mental illness, when how do we know that these narratives are really anything of value anyway? People lose it in Alzheimer's. Kids aren't being able to form these narratives with autism. Something's happening to the brain in general. It's almost like the human brain in general, not anyone's personal brain, is getting tired of living according to narratives. And it's actually breaking down the structures of those narratives. So what I'm saying is, the more we rely on those narrative structures, just a bunch of words, to generate and sustain our sense of self, the more in danger we are of losing that, because it's not as embodied. We could choose any number of narratives to have as our self-narrative, and that is just sort of a result of conditioning over time and experience. But there's something deeper than that. And I think that's what the process of map consciousness and trans consciousness is putting us into contact with. Because some of those structures are breaking down for us too. But we, at our age, we have a chance to connect with a different narrative, or make new narratives and new meanings, or find what's really meaningful. And I feel like a lot of times we do get in touch with that, and then we lose that, and then we're medicated away from ever really being in touch with that again, and fearing that, instead of really investigating what that was all about. And so that's why I think that the embodied part is really important. And even just talking to myself is embodied. It's embodied making up crap as I go along. And I think that keeps the brain fluid. I'm not caught in one narrative or two narratives, or just a certain number of bits of information, like this bit and that bit, maybe 100 little bits that I repeat to myself, and I call that myself. And then it starts to break down, and I wonder why it breaks down, when it's just these words in the brain, and these words in the brain cells that just make it almost like this locked in thing that is very susceptible to breakdown. It's not fluid. And I have no idea if this is true, but I find that whatever I read and explore, there's links to what I'm saying. And I would never want to be one to go in and study one particular aspect, because narrowing it down so much to one little thing is not really interesting to me at the moment. What's interesting is reading what other people are doing and seeing how it relates to what I've been talking about, and seeing just through talking to myself and past experience and context, and just trying to bring what other people are saying into the context of what I'm saying. Because people, if they haven't gone through this bipolar experience, wouldn't necessarily have the experience to all of a sudden want to make those connections. They wouldn't be able to. They haven't seen that worldview. So from the inside of that, I can look outside and pull outside context into this bipolar context, which anyone who's gone through this experience can do. But I feel a lot of us don't have the chance because of what we're told, how we're told to think about ourselves and look at ourselves and view ourselves, and how we have allowed others to see us. And we're not fascinated by our brains. We're afraid of it, and rightly so in a lot of regards, for sure. But I've been able to look at what people are saying and relate it to my experience. And the chapter I'm reading right now in the book actually is on schizophrenia and psychosis, and I've definitely had my days in psychosis, for sure. So it'll be interesting to see what he says about that. And I came across the term autonomic consciousness, which, according to Wiki, is the human ability to mentally place ourselves in the past, in the future or in counterfactual situations, and thus to be able to examine our own thoughts. What does counterfactual situations mean? It doesn't quite link to the right thing, but I feel like what I'm doing a little bit is auto-noetic bipolar consciousness, because I'm examining thoughts and worldviews and perspective to bipolar. So the point about the narrative as the self, which is questionable, but we take our narrative to be ourself. If we take ourselves to be a bunch of words and we lose words, or words break down, or our brain cells break down, then what are we? And to me, we've spent so much time in this narrative about ourselves, we're not really in touch with consciousness. Through the bipolar process, we get in touch with this real self, and it's scary, it's energetic, it's living, it's dynamic, it's fluid, it has its own action that isn't according to our thoughts or our narrative. It doesn't give a crap about our narrative. And that energy acts through us and actually changes our narrative by us seeing that we're something beyond our narrative. So I feel like our brain is more at risk of breaking down, and it is in more and more people now, because we're not in touch with the real essence of what we are. And that essence can get in touch with us. It can blow out all those word concepts and take us on the ride of our life. So why aren't we living the ride of our life every day? So then our brain has this real strength of selfhood, of being a human being. So on page 37, Pia Conto says, "There is something of who we are that exists separate and independent from cognition." And that's pretty obvious. But we're so identified with our cognition, and in map consciousness we become disidentified from cognition and something else comes in. And it could actually be more real if we're able to really be acquainted with it. And when it first suspends or breaks up the cognition, it's like learning a whole new language. It's like being in contact with a whole new energy and not being directed by our thought energy. And so it can be scary, but the more we're in touch with that, I think it's actually going to change our brains to actually be stronger and in touch with that living vitality that we are. I'm pretty sure all of us have had that experience when somebody's telling us this long, drawn-out story about their life, and we're thinking to ourselves, I don't really care. This is boring. I hope they stop talking. And that could be the brain in general, just really bored with relating based on hearing about someone's past. That's really not life. What happens when we actually meet in the moment as two blank slates, as two human beings? And she talks about how the body has been relegated to nothingness. Yet there's clearly some intelligence in our embodiment, and we don't exercise that through our life. We live in our concepts and words about ourselves, and so that's not really rooted in anything. It's sort of loosely in the brain. And there's a part on page 43, it talks about a specific case where a man had a brain surgery that made him remember absolutely nothing each day. But then they had him repeat a task each day of drawing a certain thing. And even though he didn't remember doing the task when he sat down to do it the next time, each time he got better at it. So that to me relates to how if we go into these altered states, subconsciously we're still learning to navigate them somehow. We're getting acquainted with those laws of physics, with those energies, with those ways of moving, with those gestures, with those brain states. We don't need a me to help us with that. The me is actually the obstacle in a way. So just going through that can help us to adapt to that. And that person, Pia Contos said, "Embodied selfhood is the idea that bodily habits, gestures, and actions support and convey humanness and individuality." So to me, this relates to epigesteretics, and actually it relates to when this energy comes in, it's an embodied energy. It makes us act differently, gesture differently, speak differently, behave differently. It's changing our embodiment. So it actually could be closer to our natural embodiment, even though it can be kind of chaotic. And so by getting in alignment with embodied mania, the way my body embodied mania, then I'm actually getting more in alignment with my embodied self. And that could actually help to eliminate those unnecessary structures in the brain that things like recovery try to tell us we're supposed to try and get back. I would say get back to the essence of mania, the embodied self. So I've been saying embody your mania, but really mania is kind of the embodied self. And of course there's some scary bits to it. I'm not saying it's all great, but the scary bits could actually be the interference of the false ego narrative structures with this embodied energy, and they're sort of overlapping, and it could almost be those two energies at war with each other. The energy of the ego thought structures of the past that have a hold on the brain cells, and the brain trying to purge itself of that through embodied action. So usually we think by analyzing our brain and our thoughts and everything, the thought structure is going to change. But Krishnamurti would say the analyzer is the analyzed. The element in our brain that we try to analyze with is the same quality, or is the same, just a different fragment of all the fragments we're trying to look at. And this energy in map consciousness, I feel, is of a different quality altogether that breaks apart all those fragments, and it's embodied energy. And so it's actually living with that energy and moving about in daily life, and those fragments sort of getting flicked away as we're moving in an embodied way with this energy. Instead of sitting and trying to analyze, we're living in that energy, and it's ridding us of those other structures. Not sitting around thinking that by thinking we can think and change our thinking. It's this whole energy coming through and changing everything that we think we know about ourselves in our actions, and breaking away from those structures that are congruent with our old ways of being. Because when we start to get in trouble in the process, it's when the thoughts start to turn against us. And then we're again acting based on thought, not acting based on that energy. So it's like the energy is dwindled out, the thought structures are coming back in, and we're again beginning to act based on our thought structures. But it can be scary, because when that energy is still kind of there, the thoughts are definitely outside the range of what we would normally consider to be our thoughts. So then this whole control and free will question comes back into play. When we were in mania, we didn't necessarily feel like we had tons of control, but everything was happening so wonderful and magical that we didn't really question. We didn't say, oh, well, I need to control this, because it was awesome. But then when it gets scary, then we feel like, whoa, I better try and control this. But I don't think we have control of any of it. So again, that's when preference comes in. Oh, I prefer the good, and it's okay if I'm out of control, or there's no one really there controlling. I'm just moving with the energy, surfing the consciousness, and then when it gets scary, then we have to try and control it. And who is the I that's trying to control it? Really, it's the body trying to save itself from these thought structures. So there's an embodiment that wants to save itself from these thought structures. And it's pretty much a war. Will the thought structures win and destroy the body? Or will the embodiment act before the thoughts can act? And so the embodiment is actually deeper than these thought structures. And just like we can become really good at typing and not have to think about it, we can become really good at embodying mania and trying to discern what that energy was attempting to show us. And then we get our free will back because we kind of aren't ready to go quite beyond that illusion of free will. It's still quite a good illusion to have, or good model. And Kantos says, we all have embodied selfhood. You have it, I have it. It's just that when our cognition is intact, it goes unnoticed. It is sort of in the background. But when we have cognitive impairment, it comes to the foreground. And so bipolar could be thought of in a way as a cognitive impairment. But I question the value of all the cognitive activities that we do. A lot of it's a waste of energy and brain power, and I think it's actually damaging the brain. And even if it's not damaging the brain, it's creating these false structures that are very prone to decline. And they're possibly meant to decline, especially when it happens in bipolar. But what I'm saying is, by putting all our energy into this cognition process, we're not putting energy into this embodiment process, and we're at risk to having our whole world that we've constructed with our thoughts and our words and our narratives about ourselves fall apart. And that's a good thing. A lot of people have this crisis and distress and move through it and find more meaning in life. But it can also be really, really challenging, and there is something more real to get in touch with. And why aren't we more in touch with that real in the first place? And she talks about how our primary method of engaging with the world is through cognition. So when it's impaired, it's difficult to engage with the world. Well, it's difficult to engage with the world that cognition has built, but maybe there's another world altogether. A world that isn't based on cognition, a world that's based on being in touch with the real. And I think that's a world that we move with and start to move into in map consciousness. And we're starting to map those areas in the brain and expand the brain and change the quality of the brain and what it's able to respond to. And when that happens, the brain actually responds violently or in a very fearful way to the structures of society, to the structures of cognition. And it talks on page 75 about our sense of agency, that the brain creates the sense of being the initiator of one's thoughts and actions, and how in something like psychosis this breaks down. In my feeling, it's changing our sense of agency. So the process of so-called psychosis is showing us what real agency is, or what different aspects of agency is. And in a way, if the brain is responding to different information with all the senses holistically at the same time, instead of just what cognition is pointing out, then it's going to move us in different ways, and it's going to feel foreign. So it's not like we don't have this sense of agency, but we're getting in touch with a different algorithm or calculation from our mind picking out a certain bit. Like if we're always worried about what people think of us or something, our brain is just thinking about that and wondering what somebody's thinking about us when they're talking or something. That's pretty trivial. And so when that false agency, in a way, drops, and there's this in touchness with everything, there's something completely different. So what can we really do? We can watch, we can be aware, but just to attribute all this to this self that isn't really real. And I guess that's what the book is kind of talking about, that what is the self if there's all these other ways the brain experiences reality. And to me, the self is kind of, well, this is what's acceptable to operate in the society that we've created. And then any breakdown in the self is treated as a medical illness instead of any number of other things that it could be. And it's profitable to do so. And they mention a woman that was born without arms and legs, and yet her whole life she felt like she had arms and legs. And they even were able to show on a brain scan that her brain was reacting as if she had arms and legs. And that, to me, brings up Rupert Sheldrake's idea of a morphogenetic field, or morphogenic field, or morphic field, or whatever it's called, and how that map can be in the brain even if those areas of the body don't develop. And how this relates to map consciousness is that I feel like there's a greater map of self beyond what we have been conditioned to map as ourself, that sort of exists like a morphic field or morphic resonance that is kind of the next evolution to what we consider to be ours, or what we consider to be what we are responsible for. And maybe we're responsible for more than just our individual body. And I probably shouldn't keep spoiling the book because it's a really good book, but I'm trying to illustrate some things that I think related to what he says, but I will be more careful. So read the book. It's fascinating. And I was even thinking in terms of part of this mapping something else, is that I think the brain needs other brains who are equally willing to map this. So if I'm mapping this on my own, it's only of a certain energy. But if there's more people that see this and are willing to map this, and it's not a thing, it's not, this is what it is, it's right there. It's changing every moment. It's moving, it's living. So other people who are willing to live in that energy and move with it and move as that energy, and that unveils more of the territory, and that changes the brain to open up those maps in the brain to make those structures more available to other people. They're like these dormant maps that when we're in the state of map conscious, when we're in so-called mania, we feel much greater than we are. And sometimes that's translated into things like grandiose thoughts, but our brain is wired to translate everything into thought. So us thinking these grandiose thoughts could actually just be the thought representation of the actual energetics that we're feeling to the best we can translate it. But really it's just saying we are more than just this body, and that's not meant to be a woo-woo thing. That's meant to be, we are in relation to everything. So if I move an orange over from point A to point B, I have just changed the whole universe to some extent. So there's some level of interaction and creating, being part of this universe and the creative process. And we think that we're autonomous, but we're not really. Like, we're related to things. We change things and they change us. As simple as we are what we eat, or things like that. So I'm the food I eat, so the food that is out there is important. So it's realizing that relationship and having a sense of that beyond just my little narrative and things like that. There's a greater language of understanding how what we're related to shapes us. And so in that way, it is kind of us. It's not really separate. And And it's one thing to say that, but it's another thing to actually feel that and live in that energy, and it's incredible. But the trouble is that then we feel really responsible, and then that's translated into the thoughts, I have to save the world and change the world, and it's up to me. Well, there is a truth to that it is up to each one of us. And we do have a tremendous responsibility, each one of us, that we're not seeing. And then when we do see it, we think that we have to save the world. And these thoughts that we have are the thought translation of what the energy is saying. And it's the best words we're able to give to it at the time. Maybe in retrospect we can give better words to it, or we can just say, well, that meant nothing. We can just say, well, I was just nuts, I was just crazy. Or we can try to remember that feeling of responsibility and what that really meant, and how we can embody that in life. Because if we're able to embody that in life and that energy comes back and we're already doing it, what's it going to do? Not much if we're already on that route. So I don't really know what I'm saying, but I'm trying to speak about that energy in retrospect and translate some of this language. And in a way, a person saying, I'm God, or I'm responsible, or I have to save the world, if each person that didn't feel that way took that just a little bit and took a little bit more responsibility, maybe that would change the world. If people were able to see the truth in some of these things people are saying, instead of just passing it off as mental illness. Because anybody could be the next one to go through it. And it's also said that the brain creates maps for everything we perceive. So if our perception is expanded in map consciousness, the brain is creating a map of that. So our brain is creating a map of those territories that we visited in altered states. And it's a territory that's right here, right now. It's just a shift in energy, a shift in perception, a shift in worldview and perspective. So we have access to a different stream of information. So it's interesting they say that in the science, and that's what I was saying in terms of map consciousness and changing perception and changing the maps in our brain. That's partly why I call it map consciousness. And sometimes people born without limbs have that feeling of having a limb, so it's animation without incarnation, as it says in the book. And I feel like map consciousness in a way is animation without incarnation, because that energy comes in and animates us in different ways and makes us gesture in different ways and behave in different ways, but we're not fully incarnated in our embodiment to hold that energy and animate in that way indefinitely. We are programmed and adapted to animate based on thought, somewhat indefinitely, but not really. And this energy can come in and break up that thought animation, and that energy is trying to incarnate. It's trying to incarnate into the brain to be the way the brain operates. So map consciousness is animation without incarnation, but it's up to us to incarnate it by embodying our mania. And it's also incarnation without animation, because we have this body that's incarnated, but it's not fully being animated by that energy. It's not really channeling all the energy it can channel. It's living in this narrow channel of thought energy. It says the body had developed fully, but somehow its representation in the brain was incomplete. So we're not representing that energy map in our brain. So maybe tomorrow I will talk more about Joe Dispenza, and not read any more of this book yet because it's really interesting and I just want to extrapolate it